Hi, I'm Mike DiGirolamo, a partner and producer with Simpatico Studios, where we live stream conversations about complex business and social challenges with professionals like yourself who are working on the same issues. Our shows are live streamed in front of a global audience on simpatico.tv. I'm hosting conversations with journalists, filmmakers, authors, entertainers, and other folks in the media on the Impact Media channel. If you're interested in the work that these professionals are doing, you came to the right place. If you work in the media and you'd like to be a guest, please reach out to me. I'm always looking for compelling creators to speak with about the work that they are doing. With that said, I'm glad you're here. Please sit back and enjoy the conversation. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to Impact Media. We have an exciting guest for you all today. His name is Dr. Gary Yohe, and he served as a lead author for many chapters for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, otherwise known as the IPCC. He was vice chair for the Third National Climate Assessment under President Obama. Currently, he writes opinion pieces on climate change and serves as co-editor-in-chief of Climatic Change with Michael Oppenheimer. Today, Gary joins us to explain how the recent extreme disaster events can be attributed to climate change, but that this explosion of extremes has made projecting the scale of associated risk much more difficult. And he further explains how COVID-19 compounds the difficulty in responding to them and how many of these climate impacts are irreversible. Joining us from Middletown, Connecticut, here's Dr. Gary Yohe. Gary, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
So, we were talking earlier about weather and temperature. It just kind of describe what is the scene like right now in Connecticut?
Oh, it's a beautiful day in Connecticut. It's about 90 or 80 degrees. We had a lot of 90-degree weather in the summer, but for a fall day in Connecticut, this is really very comfortable.
And you mentioned earlier that you had more heat waves recently, and can you let the audience know about that and how that's abnormal for what's happening currently?
Yeah, it's abnormal for here. We had more heat waves than usual, 4 instead of 2, and more 95-degree days than usual. But compared to what you all in the West Coast are suffering through, it's a little embarrassing to talk about suffering heat.
Yeah, I mean it's understandably so. It is, the situation out here is noticeably more dire. So let's go ahead and talk about that. You recently wrote an opinion piece about how these recent extreme, which it seems like these extreme events just kind of keep getting worse and worse, particularly over the past 3 or 4 years. Can you explain to us, did we see this stuff coming? And if we didn't see it coming, what does that mean going forward?
That's a really great question. We didn't see the explosion to the size of the extremes that 2020 has brought to the West Coast. 2017 was the worst fire year in California's history. And it burned 1.7 million acres, and it didn't have the largest fire in California history. Did a lot of damage. And that was an extreme, but you could almost think that, yeah, every distribution of climate impact is going to have an extreme tail. And it's all right, that was one of the extremes. So we couldn't predict it, but it wasn't all that surprising that one would happen. The next year, the worst fire in California history happened. Okay, that's sort of 2 records in a row. That's getting a little bit strange. And then along comes 2020. And 2020 it started a really severe fire season in the beginning of August. And by October 1st, there were 5 large fires still burning. One was the largest in California history, and the rest were the 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th largest in California history. And just to add on, number 18 was burning at the same time. Now that just is not expected. It could not have been conceived, thinking about what extremes are. And then so the question is, How did that happen? How can you explain it? And I truly believe that I can explain it with climate science. And the reason is, for something big like that to change so quickly, it has to be driven by a confluence of extreme events, or one or two events that are themselves changing very, very quickly. So the standard explanations for fires in California and the West Coast are fire management and drought and heat waves and things like that. But you've had those over and over again. Every once in a while you get a really bad fire. But what's happened this year is that you were suffering a record heat wave in the months of August and September, almost as hot as it's ever been before. A drought that it's in its third or fourth year of being really, really severe. You're at the end of 6 or 7 years of park beetle bug infestation in the forests, which by August of 2020, in some places had killed 85 or 95% of the forest cover. And then you had changes in the atmosphere that made it much more likely that dry lightning storms would show up, and with dramatic increases in the number of lightning strikes. Those things all happened at the same place at the same time. Any one of them was an extreme event, but they piled on top of each other and amplified the effects of each other. And that I can explain. But population didn't change very much. Fire management practices didn't change very much. The heat wave wasn't that much hotter because you've been having severe heat waves. It did the first single heat wave caused a big fire, but not 6 of them. So that's why I think it's got to be climate. And if there's a debate tonight and fires in California come up, the question I would like to hear asked is, climate science can explain the experience in the West Coast with respect to wildfires. You say you don't believe in climate science. So how do you explain it?
That would be a good question to ask, and I hope they do. And so when you say that projecting the scale of associated risk is difficult, what do you mean by that?
Risk is likelihood times consequence. Consequences depend on the confluence of impacts of climate. Taken one at a time, you get a pretty good idea of what's going to go on. Sea level rise causes possible flooding and some nuisance flooding that you can see all of the time. A coastal storm has a storm surge that's 4 or 5 feet, maybe higher than it used to be. Something like that. So sort of ordinary climate change, which shows the global climate moving from what used to be the old normal to what will become the new normal in decades from now. We can get a pretty good idea of what to expect. But when you begin to see these things piling up over and over again, and you begin to see that different sorts of climate extreme events are happening with increased intensity and increased frequency all around the world, the overall risk of climate impacts being very, very dangerous and potentially lethal is no longer a matter of if, it's a matter of when. We don't know where the next one is going to happen, but we're sure one's going to happen. And it's going to be probably worse of that type in that place than ever has been seen before.
And you mentioned something there. You were talking about, you said likelihood times consequence. I'm sorry if I'm wording what you just said, but if correct me if I'm wrong, but you put some language into the synthesis report. I want you to talk about that language that you and the IPCC came up with, and how that really changed the conversation and changed the world, for that matter.
It was in 2014, we were working on the 4th assessment report. The synthesis report is a collection of all of the important findings of all 2,500 pages. Up until then, the economic analysis of how to think about mitigating against climate change, reducing emissions, or making some sort of investment in adaptation was always thought to be a cost-benefit problem, but the uncertainties were just enormous. And what we did, Steve Schneider and Bill Hare and I, in the last authors meeting before the plenary to approve the synthesis report, sat down and spent about 3 days crafting 22 words that essentially said climate change, responding to climate change is an iterative risk management problem involving integration and adaptation and mitigation, taking into account attitudes towards risk, distributions, costs and benefits, co-benefits and things like that. But the critical word was risk, because as you just said, risk is mathematically the product of likelihood and consequence. And if you're just doing cost-benefit analysis, you tend to spend a lot of time thinking about the middle case, the most likely case. A risk-based approach says, hold on, there are some tails out there. There are some low probability events out there that we can think about that aren't terribly likely. If you look at them, maybe 3% chance or 5% chance or something like that. But if they show up, the consequences are enormous. And risk is probability times consequence. A small number times an enormous number is still a pretty big number. And so it says you should worry about that. We went to the countries of the world, and 169 countries agreed with us, which meant that the climate clients of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the countries of the world, were saying, we want to hear about risk. And we want you to talk about not only the best guesses of how the future is going to look, but we also want to know about the low probability, high consequence events. We want to be able to begin thinking about those and responding to those in the ways that you've told us to do it. And so all of a sudden, the science community was freed to be able to talk about those things and not be called fearmongers. We weren't doing this just to scare everybody to death. We were doing this because it was good policy in the best interest of every country in the world.
And that was a remarkable accomplishment to get all those countries to agree on that wording. And I just want to make sure that people understand like the magnitude of that kind of accomplishment. Switching back to what we were talking about earlier, and you kind of already sort of touched upon this, but how did things become so dangerous so quickly? Do you have an idea as to why is it that all of a sudden now we're just seeing out of the blue, it seems like, or at least it's not out of the blue because the writing was on the wall, but like this hurricane season was just ridiculous. And like, how did it get to this point seemingly so quickly?
Yeah. That's also a really, really good question. Climate change doesn't cause hurricanes. Climate change doesn't cause wildfires. It just makes both of them worse. And the way that the science works around those potential events is nonlinear. And so the underlying mathematics and physics say that you can't really expect it to be sort of a straight line. Well, you know, it's twice as bad as it was 10 years ago. It's going to be the same amount higher 10 years from now. Well, no, it probably will be twice as big as where you are now back then. And then what happens is that there are threshing points in the climate system and threshold points in impacts. For example, hurricanes. All of a sudden, there is the difference in temperature between the Arctic and the tropics. This is a little in the weeds, but I'll get out of the weeds.
Go ahead.
Is diminishing because the Arctic is warming faster than the equator. That reduces the energy that drives and creates the atmospheric currents like the jet stream that determine our weather. So they get weaker. So along comes a hurricane of normal strength. It goes over water in the Gulf of Mexico that's never been this hot before. And so it gets more and more intense. And Instead of staying a category 2 or 3, it gets to a 4 or 5. It goes on land, say it goes on to Texas in 2017, and it's a category 5. It's 30 miles inland in Texas, right over Houston. Looks around, and the steering currents have weakened to the point where there's nothing in the science, nothing in the atmosphere, nothing in the ocean to tell the hurricane where to go. So what does it do? It stops. And it sits there for almost 48 hours dropping rain. And Houston got 42 inches of rain in 48 hours.
And have we ever really seen anything like that before?
They hadn't, but that was the third 500-year flood that they had in 3 years. So something had changed someplace to make them much more vulnerable to that type of extreme event. And then the change in the climate system made those extreme events more intense.
There's something that I want to point out here now. There's some disinformation floating around in the media saying that things will just change back. Oh, it'll just go back. You'll see, it'll happen. Gary, why is this not going to go back? Why is this not going to just change back?
Well, it won't. It simply will not. And the reason why it's so intuitive for the president to be able to say, yeah, it's been changing, but it'll change back, is that people are very comfortable with pendulums. They grew up with them, and they see them going back and forth, and they go out to here and they go out to there, but they always come back to the center, and they never go too much further than the previous extreme. Well, what's going on with climate is it's taking the anchor of the pendulum and moving it. And so as you move it, the pendulum could still be swinging in the same dimension, but it's suddenly further out this way than it used to be, and it's not going as far out as it used to over here. This pace of the anchor, the direction of the anchor is fixed, and the pace of it is accelerating, and it won't go back down until temperatures go back down. And temperatures won't go back down until the concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere go down. And it takes every year about 1% of the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere ends up in the oceans or something like that. But of course, we throw a lot more back up into the atmosphere, and it's cumulative emissions that generate carbon dioxide atmospheric concentrations, and that creates the temperature trajectory. And until you take away cumulative emissions that have already been thrown up there, the temperature is not going to go back. And if the temperature doesn't go back, we're not going to go back. The climate's not going to go back.
And that anchor will continue to keep moving.
The anchor keeps going and at a faster rate.
And so when it does swing back, it's actually going to swing back to what we previously thought of as one end of the extreme or the center. It's not going to swing back further. Right.
It just had a conversation about with a couple of scientists about the following deal. The tundra the permafrost in the tundra is melting. It's releasing methane. Actually what it does is releases carbon, and that turns into methane and CO2. And it's long been held that is the potential for a runaway greenhouse effect. Once the permafrost melts, it's not going to freeze back for thousands of years. And it will release and release and release all this methane and heat the world. A group of scientists have done some paleo work and said, well, hold on. There isn't a terribly strong signal about methane release at the end of the last ice age. So it's not nearly as likely that we're going to get a big bump in temperature increases from methane. Okay, so how do you bring those two things together? The established science was that it's going to get really, really hot from this effect. Now we've got something that says maybe it won't. Okay, so you say, we'll be a little bit more cautious. We'll say the likelihood that we're going to get this extreme melting, it's just gone down some. And that's the way I am comfortable expressing that, because it's that extreme that generates the extreme consequences. So that's the high risk possibility. The scientists had just discovered this stuff about the paleoclimates, and no, what we wanted to say is it's now more likely that the methane emissions will be smaller. Well, nobody cares about small methane emissions. We can live with those. That's not where the focus of attention should be. So we will now negotiate that out. How to express that new science. And then we'll tell everybody what's going on.
So, Gary, this has been a really amazing conversation so far. I do want to make sure that I get to ask you a bit about your time working in the IPCC, and you talk about the fact that you got together with this group of scientists from all over the world, and your commitment was really to working on the science, and it wasn't necessarily you guys that were assigning the acceptable degrees of temperature, but rather it was the UN that made those decisions. Can you talk about that and clear the air for the audience?
Great. The United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change was signed in the late 1980s and ratified around 1990. So don't quote me on the date. The countries looked around and said, look, if we're going to negotiate about climate, maybe we should know something about it. So they formed the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and put it under the World Meteorological Organization inside the United Nations. And it was assigned the task of every 5 or 6 years surveying the existing science, the peer-reviewed published literature, and writing an assessment. What do we know, and how confident are we in saying that we know this or know that? And it's those documents that are referred to as consensus documents, but it doesn't mean that every finding has unanimous consent of all 20,000 scientists around the world. Every finding has a confidence statement with it, and it means every scientist is comfortable with the statement about the likelihood and the consequence. And we were, as an institution, intergovernmental, which means we didn't work for the United Nations, we didn't work for the Security Council, and we were forbidden by charter for being policy prescriptive. So we couldn't tell anybody what to do about this. All we could tell them is what we think is going to happen. And if you continue to do this, then this is going to happen. Whereas here's a range of what might happen. And if you reduce emissions by this much, then impacts will go down. Here's a distribution of the value of doing that. But we never, ever, because we weren't allowed, said things like 2 degrees is the magic number. And if warming goes above 2 degrees centigrade relative to pre-industrial levels, the world's going to go to hell in a handbasket, and there's just nothing we can do. Climate change is irreversible, and we're stuck. Scientists were not allowed, and were not skilled enough to be able to identify what is dangerous. The Framework Convention said countries should hold concentrations below a level to prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate change, with the climate system, and it was their job to tell us what was dangerous. So it was the countries of the world negotiating in Copenhagen and then Paris that decided 2 degrees was a limit that they were comfortable with. Maybe it should be 1.8, 1.5 degrees. We'll ask IPCC to get together and see what would happen if we stopped at 1.5 degrees. By the way, we're at 1 now, so we're well on the way to 1.5. So that was our job to do then. And they will meet again. The 6th assessment report is coming out next year. There will be another set of plenaries where they will sit down and work out the consensus language and move on.
Gary, you just beautifully explained something that I was going to ask you a bit about, is that, why is it important for governments and politicians to listen to scientists? Because, as you know, we've had someone in the media recently, saying that scientists have a political agenda, and you just pretty much beautifully spelled it out, that really your commitment is to the science and showing what will happen when certain thresholds are reached, and that it was actually, these governing bodies in the UN that decided those limits and those thresholds. Do you have any words of in response to that kind of narrative that's being spelled that scientists have a political agenda?
Yes, I do. Scientists, when they're doing science, do not have a political agenda. They are professional skeptics. Even existing knowledge is a question. Is that really still true? Should we look at that again? You go after this, you go after that, and you report objective findings from what the data say, from what the experiments say. But that doesn't mean that scientists don't have opinions about what should be done. And I'm an economist, so I work in the interface between, I'm a consumer of the natural and physical science of climate. I provide input into policy decisions about what to do. And I can do positive analysis of if you did this or you do that, but it's not my job to be normative. Again, it's not my job necessarily to tell governments exactly what they should do, but I have a personal opinion, and I express that. So when you introduced me, you said, my friends and I are doing a lot of opinion pieces. Yes, we are, because we do have an opinion, and it is informed by 20, collectively, the four of us have more than 100 years experience in IPCC and doing climate research. So we think we know what we're talking about, and we also know what we do when we don't know what we're talking about. So we're perfectly comfortable saying those sorts of things, and we put that out there. Not every scientist is comfortable with that, and if you do it in a national lab that is funded by the federal government under this administration, your lab might close because they don't want you out there talking about stuff that goes against the way they view the world.
Wow. Let me just say, I am glad that you write those opinion pieces, and we are so lucky to have you doing that. We have now reached the end of our episode. It has been an absolute privilege to speak with you. We are going to transition into just chatting, so just go ahead and hang tight, and we'll be right back.
Thank you.